thinking that way and making the decisions as to how can this chord sound if I make the bass note different. And again, part of that process is knowing where those notes are located on the bass. And the quicker you find them at the time you need them, the more effective the line can be and the more you can develop.
We're bringing you another classic Contrabass Conversations episode, or at least a recent classic, or however you want to categorize this. This is, you probably recognize that voice. If not, that is the great Ron Carter, one of the living legends of not only jazz bass, but jazz in general, and really music in general. Ron Carter, what a legend. This was early in restarting the podcast, and I got connected with Ron through my former student, Dan Shimolinski, who was at Juilliard studying with Ron and now is playing with Joey Alexander and just totally crushing it. Go Dan, you rock. And this was a nerve-wracking conversation for me. Ron can be an intimidating guy, and it was kind of where I was thinking, do I want to see if I can make a full-time go of it, doing this thing as my career? And so I had a lot of nerves going into this because Ron, famous. I don't know him. We were doing it over the phone, all sorts of things that can make for an intimidating experience. And I did not mention this when I put this episode out, but listen to the tone of my voice and hear how high I'm speaking. I was kind of nervous, so Mr. Carter. So there are a lot of questions that are, at least I get that. Maybe you don't when you listen back. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Ron Carter. And I do want to thank our wonderful sponsors that we've got here at Contrabass Conversations. And I want to thank the Upton Bass String Instrument Company, their Bostonian bass. It was conceived at the 2009 ISB convention. I was at that convention in State College, Pennsylvania. And it came from a conversation with world-renowned jazz bassist and former podcast guest Lynn Seaton and Gary of Upton Bass. They were playing and discussing various instruments Upton had created, and they began jotting down Lynn's preferences. And what came as a result of this rough outline was the Bostonian model of Upton Bass. Upton's got a great mission, a great story. Their instruments rock. They're in the hands of amazing bassists worldwide, several of whom have been on the podcast, and we've got some great interviews coming up with Eric Rivas, Branford Marcellus's bassist, of course. We've got Kevin Smith, who's Willie Nelson's bassist. They both play Upton basses, and we talk about them. So uptonbass.com will take you to their website. You can learn more there. And thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. And thank you also, if you're a jazz player, check out our sponsor, D'Addario Strings, and their Zyx strings. They are fantastic jazz strings. They're synthetic core strings that produce an extremely warm and rich sound. So you can get the sound and feel of gut strings with more evenness, projection, and stability than real gut. Again, such a thrill to chat with Ron Carter. Thank you, Dan Shimolinski, for connecting us. And one final thing before we get to the episode. I know you want to hear Ron, but this was one of the very first episodes where I kind of thought of, what if I make this more of a documentary and intersperse music than just a straight up interview? This was the first time I really did what is now kind of what I do for most episodes. So I kind of think of this is episode 188, I think, as the first of kind of the way I do episodes now. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation with the great Ron Carter. Now, Ron grew up right outside of Detroit, and his first instrument was actually the cello, which he started to play at the age of 10. What do you think attracted you to the cello specifically?
The young lady, the band director, came to my neighborhood, which is a small community in outside Detroit called Ferndale, with this table full of instruments, and she decided to start a small orchestra in this African American school. And she said, "These are instruments that are available. Take one you want, and we'll see if we can make this band make these kids have a great orchestra." And she did, and I picked the cello.
And when you arrived at the bass, how do you think your cello playing shaped your concept of bass technique?
Well, it gave me an idea of how to practice productively. I'm on my students all the time about just fooling around and calling it practice. I mean, that's not really how you get better. Having to prepare lessons at a very early age, at 11 to 12, 13, and for teachers who were specific in trying to monitor your growth patterns and give you stuff that you could kind of cover and have a good musical sense of it all. Learning how to practice as a 12-year-old was very important to my development as a cellist, and I carried that over to my teaching as it is as a bass player and teacher.
At what point in your musical development did you start to listen to jazz?
When I was a freshman in college, there was guys playing all the time in Detroit as a high school. I never got involved with it because my intent was to be a classical cellist / bassist. Mm-hmm. And when I got to Eastman as a freshman, there were always guys playing jazz in the hallway. That was my first permanent exposure. Then I would go home to Detroit for weekends, and my neighbors all had jazz records and jazz bands, so I was always in that kind of environment, although I'm not a participant. And I didn't become a participant in that environment until I got to my junior year in Eastman. I joined a little house band that played for solo jazz acts coming through Rochester, which is on the way to New York from Canada. That was my exposure to it initially.
Now, you have a strong orchestral foundation on the bass with your degrees from Eastman and Manhattan School. What do you think that technical foundation on the bass opened for you musically that other players might not have had?
Well, as a bass player, you know how to play with other bass players, and I found that jazz bass players don't have the opportunity to know what it's like to play with a second bass player or, in fact, 4 or 5 others in the section. So this is a valuable experience as to find out where is the pitch actually going in this orchestra and this bass section, how to turn pages correctly, how to sit so that your bow doesn't hit the other guy's bass, general orchestral protocol. All those things are important in being a mature person as well as a player, not just carry those things into my musical life.
And at what point did you decide that was the direction you were going to go musically in terms of professional life?
When I got to the orchestra level in Eastman, I was informed that the orchestras were not looking for a very talented African-American musician to join their ranks. Mm-hmm. And I had done some gigs with guys come to New York, and they assured me that New York always looked for a good bass player. I should come and join the crowd.
Another thread that I've heard in previous interviews with you, I'd love to talk about a little bit, is just technique on the bass and efficiency of technique. What do you focus on with students to develop their efficiency of technique?
We start with Dismantle Book 1. These are the positions, these are notes that you can play without having to move around, having them sync more horizontally rather than vertically. I've got a book coming out, this is February. Hopefully by September, my book will be on the market with some new things in there that helps them understand how the bass functions as a horizontal concept. One of my concerns is that teachers who teach jazz bass don't necessarily increase the students' technique to make the demands of another variety of changes and new compositional styles and stuff that he's required to do that wasn't necessary like 15 years ago. So I'm a stickler for increasing the student skill level by way of Dismantle Book 1 and 2.
And so I'm assuming that you do a lot of work with the bow with your students.
Yes.
Is that primarily for intonation or just to round them out as a player?
Both, to round them out as a player primarily. They have pretty good pitch. Mm-hmm. I just want to make them be more competitive for the New York market of off-Broadway shows and to be a Broadway sub or have a job in a Broadway pit band. There's good money there. The music is great. Instead, you get the benefits, you get the hospital, you get the dental costs, and all that stuff taken care of by the contract, by the Broadway show. So it's a wonderful way to make music. And then you meet guys, and the level of music is really high. And it's a good way to kind of get the bass under control, be guaranteed to play it every night for as long as that particular show runs. So it's more for their rounding out of shows and rounding out the performance, and the kind of work that's in New York, rather than specifically have them play better in tune.
Now, you're somebody that really changed the game in terms of bass lines, how people think of bass lines. And I think about Miles and Herbie and all those great records and the notes you'd pick. That people weren't expecting those notes. And then Herbie would fill them out. And I'm just curious, how did you get to that place musically where you were thinking that way, where you were making those decisions?
I think I was a little both. I was thinking that way and making the decisions as to how can this chord sound if I make the bass note different. And again, part of that process is knowing where those notes are located on the bass. And the quicker you find them at the time when you need them, the more effective the line can be and the more you can develop a thought pattern. I tell my students, if you're playing the first measure of a piece, you should already be looking at the third measure to make these three measures connected by a line, a story, a concept that makes a harmonic direction of the bass line lead to a specific, very important note based on the construction of your bass line. I never play one measure at a time. I'm always playing one measure and reading through the next 4 or 5. If I'm playing a song that I already know and I'm not worried about the changes, I'm playing the first measure trying to figure out how can I make the first ending sound different based on my notes that lead up to that first and second ending. So it's kind of that process. I'm a big fan of Bach's bass lines because they seem to be perfect for what the music is writing. And again, that he has reharmonized some of those melodies 3 or 4 times, and the bass line is still an integral part of that reharmonization. Is another way to look at a possibility of making your bass lines equal to the intensity of the melody rather than just kind of being the guy behind the palm tree. Years ago when I met Arthur Nelson in the early 60s, he told me my lines sounded so well constructed and they were stood by themselves. I should sit down and write a book. Well, I finally did. This is it. It's called Building a Jazz Bass Line, and it's put out by Hal Lindert, available at the stores right now.
Yeah, I just, when I hear your bass lines, they sound so much like melodies to me. Are you thinking of your bass lines as melodies?
Absolutely. I'm hoping that someone will hear this melody and do 2 things. Recognize the tune without the melody, based on my changes, and to enjoy the melody of the bass lines that they don't need the melody to make the song complete for them.
I'm just curious, what do you think gives you the ability to do that?
A lot of hard work.
Yeah.
A lot of listening to the band around me and not being afraid to ask questions about what is this chord, and if you read voice it, what kind of sound does it make? Mm-hmm. My ability to accept. I played a terrible note last week. Can I fix that note tonight? And there's something called a creator. Oh yeah, that guy. He helps me. Yeah.
Okay.
Education has been a major focus for Ron throughout his life, both as a double bass teacher and as an advocate for teaching the arts in general. We discussed this a little bit.
What can we be doing to develop the next generation of music lovers out there?
Music lovers broadly, or music lovers through the school system?
Music lovers through the school system. Like what should we be doing in there?
You got to have groups playing there. I mean, right now most school programs don't have music. They don't have a fine arts program. And the first thing I think to do is have an orchestra, have a band, have a choir, have an orchestra, have the things that we had when I was their age, 10, 11, and 12, have a marching band. I mean, the music available for these kids is not there anymore. And one of the reasons we're seeing music interest drop off is that the kids who are now the ones who are typically carrying that audience flag, so to speak, they're not having a chance to hear this music. They're not having a chance to play when they're 10, 11, and 12 years old to understand what joys it can bring them and how much their families are going to love to hear them play saxophone at an ungodly hour in the morning or plunk along on piano lessons for 6 hours full of stuff that they don't have a chance to experience. And I'm very sorry that they don't have the chance to have the enjoyment I had when I was their age. And I think the first thing we have to do is get music back in the schools because they need that stuff desperately. And my friend used to say he longs for the day when the school program is assured financially and the football team needs a cookie sale for uniforms.
Yeah, I like that.
Ron maintains an active performing schedule and does a lot of traveling with the bass, and we get into some bass gear details.
In terms of traveling with a bass, obviously that's a... Right. I know it hasn't gotten any easier over the years.
Oh, man.
Are you just doing the gauge full-size case? How are you getting an instrument around these days?
Well, when I cannot drive to the gig, be it Washington, D.C. or Boston or Philadelphia, I'm like everybody else flying to wherever the gigs are, either inside the United States or Europe or Japan or South America. Mm-hmm. It depends on how extensive the tour is, and if I know anyone there whose basses I've played before. I do have something called a flyaway made by Lemure Bass, which is the next best thing to mine that's portable. I just came back from a tour last 2 months ago, and I played approximately 35 sets, 35 40-minute sets, and I had 7 basses, and that's really a tough time for me to accept that I could have my bass, and can I make this bass do what I think my ear tells me is possible on a bass. There are several guys have had their basses reconfigured to be a cutaway or flyaway bass, and some guys have bought the Jakis from David Gage, and some have set up bases in Europe that they can go and always get the same bass. I trust my judgment. I kind of trust what the guy's going to give me, and I've had some great luck using bases that they provide, and I've had some not so great luck. So it's kind of, again, it's like going to school free, trying to make this bass do what it can't do for somebody else, and see if I can get lucky.
Could you let folks know a little bit about your main bass, what you're playing on?
Right now I have a Jusek I've had since 1960.
Uh-huh.
It was made in 1910 according to the label inside, and as I understand that the pedigree, the parts were made in Czechoslovakia and sent to Berlin to be assembled back in those days. I have a second one that I'm kind of working on, a Prince Tyrolean, whose make and model I have no idea, but it's late 1900s. Mm-hmm. And I finally got the sound that's kind of what I'm looking for out of a second fiddle. But the one I have now is a Jusek, and I use a David Gage pickup on it, and I have a Epiphany amplifier and preamp, and I have the Labella strings 7700.
And you've been using those Labella strings on it since you've had it?
Oh, about Attila Zola and I kind of invented them maybe 25 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. One of the common threads I've heard listening to interviews with you in the past is that you really have experimented a lot in terms of setup over the years, strings, even woods for end pins. How has all this experimentation shaped your tone over the years?
Well, it hasn't shaped my tone so much as it allowed me to keep the same one I've had down through the years. As you know, they've made improvements in strings, they've made improvements in woods, they've made improvement in end pins, they've made improvement in pickups, amplifiers, and recording. All these factors are something we're looking at every day, and I think if I wanted to keep the same kind of sound that I want to be responsible for, it seemed necessary for me to find out what ways are they finding to reproduce this sound.
Mm-hmm. In terms of some of the more modern technology, in terms of pickups and then also strings, what are you using these days? What are you enjoying?
Well, David Gage kind of keeps upgrading what he has. So right now I'm using the Lifeline that's a great new one that he's put out now on the market now, and I'm still using the Bella 7700. They're a great combination for me.
And do you ever experiment with different string bands on your bass, or do you always do a complete set across the bass?
Well, my feeling is starting to change as I get older, and I'm forced to play on different strings due to the inability to be able to take my bass from New York to the gigs in Europe and Japan. So I've had the chance to experiment with various setups and various combinations of strings, and I found that some basses really sound good with a set that's not matched, and I found the reverse is also true. String bass players that have mixed sets, I think they're missing the point of what one set could do for the instrument. So I'm kind of like still an experimenting scientist with regards to string setups. I personally prefer the same set for all my strings because I think that's how they were made to function. Mm-hmm. There are guys who disagree with that and have successful sounds, so I'm kind of watching it take place.
You've
been hearing Ron perform both pizzicato and arco on the Piccolo Bass throughout this episode, and Ron talks a little bit about this instrument.
Something I associate with you is the Piccolo Bass. Can you tell us a little bit about Piccolo Bass?
Well, it's a half-size fiddle that's tuned upper fourth from the big bass top string C, G, D, A. And the reason I kind of invented it in that I had a guy make up one since there was not one on the scene. So I wanted my bass to be high enough from the rhythm bass in my quartet originally to have me stand out above his sound without having too much stuff to worry about in terms of range and texture and sound. Right now, I have a really early 1800 half-size bass that I have strung up like that. I call it like a cello upside down. Mm-hmm. And it's just enough of like a tenor bass, if I need that kind of title for it, that has me above the big bass sound without having him be concerned about our arrangings been in a way. Mm-hmm. And the better the players are, the more range we both have, because we understand the range that we're dealing with. And we're not just kind of saying what we do and not conscious of our equal bass environment. Again, I use the Labella 7710 lights for that bass because it's a smaller bass with a shorter string length, and I don't need to have a string that thick or that heavy to make this bass ring in that register.
And you're playing that with, you've got like a nonette with 4 cellos, is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And we're having a great time. But those young ladies are fantastic, and I can't say enough of how they make my night fun.
Yeah. That's an interesting set of timbres with the cellos and the piccolo bass. What made you think of using that instrument combination?
Well, I was determined to get Creed Taylor to give me a record date, and I thought if I brought this kind of ensemble into him to listen to, he would kind of be interested in it. So I got a gig at the gigs at the Lewis Vanguard years and years ago, and he came by and I thought that the band, that sound had some interesting recording possibilities, and I've been going on with it since then.
Yeah.
Even after decades of performing and teaching and well over 2,200 album credits, Ron is a man in constant motion. Here's what he has coming up.
You also got a big band and some other groups that you play with at least semi-regularly.
Well, big band is hard to get work outside New York because the travel is so expensive.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, we limit to New York to twice a year, which is not enough, but it's enough for me to say, 1, I got a big band, and 2, I have a very good big band. Mm-hmm. I have a trio with Russell Malone and Donald Baker, which is more of a traveling size band in that we can work anywhere on the road and have a great time because the drums physically moving around, the extra cost for travel, and pick up the bass when we get there, and we look forward to having some different music. And the quartet with piano, bass, drums, percussion with Irene Rosnes and piano and Peyton Crossley on drums and Rolando Morales Matos on percussion. It's like a nice quintet with no horn, and I have a great time with those guys.
You've certainly outlasted a lot of your contemporaries in the jazz scene, taking care of yourself over the years. And what do you think you've done in terms of health that has allowed you to keep playing as long as you have?
I'm not really sure, but wherever it is, I want to keep doing it.
Okay.
It's a great time.
Again, thank you, Ron, for taking the time and chatting with me and helping out a super nervous, not novice podcaster, but kind of, I've done hundreds of interviews since this point with wonderful jazz artists. If you're new to Contrabass Conversations, maybe this piqued your interest, seeing Ron Carter. That's understandable. I've chatted with many other great jazz bassists, and there's an easy place to go to check out all of those. That is contrabassconversations.com/jazz. Every time I chat with somebody like Gary Peacock, Larry Grenadier, the list goes on and on, Carlos Henriquez, I make sure that it goes in that category. So you can check that out. And a great way to find all of these episodes and sift through these hundreds of episodes, it'll probably be thousands, not too long from now, is our Contrabass Conversations app. We have over 5,000 people with that app. You can go to the iOS App Store, Android App Store, Kindle App Store, and pick up a copy. It is totally free. It's got extras not found on the podcast, so it's a great way to connect with us. You can leave us feedback. You can search for anything in any of these episodes. It's an awesome. You can download them, favorite them, do all sorts of things with them. It's a really useful tool. Be sure to check that out if you haven't. Thanks again to our great sponsors. Thanks to all of you for listening. I appreciate it so much. I will be back very soon with all kinds of great new episodes, and I really hope you're enjoying these classic episodes from the Contrabass Conversations archives. That's it for today. We will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.